welcome to the Centre for Progressive Policy's third online Labour Party conference event, this conference. And today we will be discussing Labour's approach and policies that they need to endorse to level up the UK. Firstly, some introductions and housekeeping. My name is Zoe Billingham. I am Head of Policy at the Centre for Progressive Policy. We are a think tank that work with local leaders across the UK to develop policy recommendations to rebalance and breed inclusive growth. It's now been dubbed levelling up, so that's what brings us here today. Just in terms of housekeeping, we will be recording this session and disseminating it more broadly after this event. And if we may suggest you go onto speaker view, that might make things a bit simpler for the audience. If you have any questions at all along the way, please do just pop them in chat. There will be an opportunity in the last 20 minutes for discussion and questions with our speakers today, so really invite you to do so. Straight after this session, the Centre for Progressive Policy will be also hosting a policy clinic, so if you'd like to stay on board for that, please do. If you'd like to tweet about today's session, we're at #CPPLevelUp. So, levelling up, a somewhat new theme for the current government, but a recurring theme for Labour. Keir Starmer, in his speech to conference just this morning, set out that if levelling up is to mean anything, it must mean closing the education gap and making sure no child is held back. No doubt the COVID crisis has made levelling up a bit harder, with schools having been shut over the summer and the health impacts being felt most acutely by Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities and those in most disadvantage. So with this ever more urgent backdrop, our discussion today will focus on the ideas and policies Labour should pursue to deliver on the levelling up agenda. We will also take a look at the upcoming fiscal events this autumn to discuss what a Labour government would be doing. To help us answer these large questions, we have an exciting panel of speakers for you today, each who have 10 minutes to set out their policy ideas on the levelling up agenda before we open up for discussion and questions from you, the audience. So in order of appearance, we will start off with Charlotte Alldritt, who is Director at the Centre for Progressive Policy, who will be setting out CPP's approach to the levelling up work agenda. Rushanara Ali has been MP for Bethnal Green and Bow since 2010. She is a former Shadow Cabinet member and a current member of the Treasury Select Committee. Rushanara will speak to the central questions of this session, in particular the role of education and skills. And by no means but least, we will hear from Richard Partington, The Guardian's economics correspondent, who has been keeping a close eye on the levelling up agenda and doing much writing about it. Richard will speak to both the policies and politics involved. So without further ado, may I pass over to Charlotte.
There we go, thank you. I've just found on this platform it takes a little while to unmute, so apologies for that, just bear with us throughout. But thank you for joining us, and thank you, Zoe, for that tremendous introduction. I think it's really fair to say that we've been doing levelling up long before levelling up was kind of invented as a slogan, as will many people in on the panel and in the audience today. And I think we should not be dispirited when we're not inventing new policies that tackle these long-term problems. But I think we need to understand what does work, why, and how at this critical time we can really harness all of that to deliver and implement those ideas, new and old, to really see a shift in the dial on economic and social outcomes. Because as Zoe outlined, you know, we have seen decades of entrenched inequalities between different social groups, between different regions, and within regions themselves. And, you know, we'll hear later from Rushanara, who is an MP for a London constituency. And often this agenda is defined as levelling up kind of London, the South East versus everybody else. Let's drag everyone up to that particular level. But I'm sure Rushanara will tell us more about actually the realities of what it is to represent a borough, a constituency where you will not, you know, it's not as clear cut as that, and there'll be many people who live in poverty and who are, you know, don't necessarily feel they are part of the London success story. And I think that narrative is really important and something that's always stayed with me as I've been working on inclusive growth over the years. The idea that people, whilst, you know, in 2000, you know, a few years ago, 2006, for example, let's look back and think, you know, the UK economy was really at its peak, thriving, huge rates of growth relative to what we have now. But if you ask people on the ground whether they've really felt that, what was their lived experience of that? I don't think they'd necessarily say that they were benefiting from the proceeds of that growth, even at a time where the then Labour government was seeking to invest heavily and reform public services. So I think there's something we need to cling to, which is an understanding of what are people's day-to-day lived experience of the economy. And I'm sure we'll touch on this idea of good jobs later in the discussion. But there's three things that I really want to talk about in my 10 minutes. And really they speak to the idea of social infrastructure and devolution. So the first two, social infrastructure, education and skills, Keir's definitely right to put that top of the list. And a few months ago, almost at the start of the crisis, the CPP published a report called Reskilling for Recovery. And there we set out that we saw that potentially millions of people were going to be in zombie jobs and or dropping off a proverbial cliff come the end of the furlough scheme. And we called on government then to say, what are you doing now to reskill those workers, to give them access to training, to enable them to as smoothly and swiftly as possible stay or shift within the labour market, and, you know, to uphold their standard of living and enable them to sustain and support their families. So a right to retrain was at the heart of that agenda, alongside a learner living allowance. And it's something that I'm sure our head of skills, Andy Norman, will talk later on in the session to follow this, and he can get into some of the detail. But just the key takeaway is we need to upskill and retrain our workforce now, so that we don't get to the end of the furlough scheme, whenever that ultimately comes, if it is indeed at the end of October, and then wonder why so many people are unemployed and struggling to get back in. It would be another crisis without excuse, because we know this has been coming for so long. So education and training has got to be priority number one. The other thing, number two, that this crisis has shown is the depth and pervasive nature of health inequalities in our society. And something that, again, CPP has been calling on for a long time, which is understanding the relationship between population health, particularly the role of public health, in wider social and economic policy as a real kind of linchpin of inclusive economies, and the relationship between health and economic productivity being much more symbiotic than we typically recognise in policy making. So health inequalities, tackling health inequalities really, I think, are the key proxy for inclusive growth. If we can achieve that, we start to see that we are making strides on inclusive growth measures, and a report that we published last year really showed that. Finally, devolution. If we're going to really see a step change, we need an institutional architecture that allows us to integrate social and economic policy, deliver social infrastructure across the board within the context of an economic strategy tailored to place. And that sounds like a lot of policy wonky jargon, but what it means is we can't think about doing economic recovery, doing economic growth. We don't think about how that relates to people, the way they live their lives, their patterns of travel to work, potentially in 6 months' time when we're back in the office. you know, we need to really understand the challenges and opportunities of place if we're to understand how we drive our economies and how we enable everyone to benefit as much as possible and contribute to that as richly as possible. So 3 things: education and training, tackling health inequalities and seeing that as integral to an economic strategy, and finally, devolution and the role that must play in tailoring and integrating all of the above so that it fits the needs of our communities. And I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Charlotte. That was a great insight into our work and upcoming work. Of course, we have a paper on levelling up being published just next week. Without further ado, may I pass over the microphone to Rushanara, please.
Hi there. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. That was fascinating, and I think I want to start off by thanking the Centre for Progressive Policy for bringing all of us together in this event at what is an incredibly challenging time for our country and our movement. And I think this debate about inequality, of course, we've been, as a party, we've been absolutely and rightly obsessed with tackling inequality. And it's good that the Conservative Party has finally discovered inequality and finally discovered that they need to tackle regional inequalities as well as other forms of inequalities, and have come up with the phrase levelling up. But let's just go back for a minute. Let's go back to the 80s. Let's go back to decades of intensive centralization of our economy and away from the regions, away from if you go back to the 80s, the way that the mining communities were affected and the failure of governments to then transform regions and support them with investment. And of course, you know, the last Labour government did a great deal, but many would argue not enough. But certainly in the Conservative years of the 80s, those of us who are 80s children still remember the scarring effect of the 1980s recession and the fact that we saw generations facing unemployment and their children facing unemployment and lower life chances and opportunities that goes back to economic harms from previous periods of mass unemployment. So the context in which we are thinking about all of these issues, of course, are even greater in terms of the challenges. We've got, since 2016, we had the Brexit referendum and all the economic uncertainties that went with that, and continues to be looming large, with the prospect of a disorderly Brexit very much in the horizon. The best case scenario is still going to be a deal that's not going to give us frictionless trade, and likely to and even end up in a no-deal Brexit situation. You know, we know what the consequences of that is likely to be if the government can't guarantee frictionless trade and secure a free trade agreement. We're a million miles away from anything like what we have had with the European Union, including in the transition period. Then we have the pandemic and the health impact, and then, of course, the associated impact on our economy. Now, we have seen already 700,000 people losing jobs within this period since March, and the prospect of a 10% unemployment by the end of the year, and a significantly higher proportion of young people facing unemployment, over 500,000 already not in jobs. And then the worst case scenario could be anything like 13% by 2021 of unemployment. Now, that is a scale that we haven't seen in a very long time. So the challenge for any political party is greater than ever before in dealing with the inequalities that have already existed between communities, between groups, between regions over previous decades, which has been laid bare even more in terms of death rates, in terms of the impact on minorities, but those from poorer backgrounds, the different levels of experiences and impacts in terms of what the COVID crisis has shown up. In a way, it's laid bare all those things that experts and those working in the front line, and particularly, of course, in our own party, we've been well aware of the impact of inequality. It literally kills people. And if we needed any further proof of the impact of those inequalities, then the coronavirus pandemic has shown how those inequalities then culminate in those people who have suffered in terms of health impacts and other impacts, and the way that this disease then has a disproportionate impact on those who've fared worse. If you look at social class backgrounds, you know, you're twice as likely to be at risk of dying because of this disease. Ethnic minorities, much higher, significantly higher. Those from Bangladeshi or in the Black community, who are twice as likely to, men twice as like Bangladeshi or Black men twice as likely to die of COVID than other groups. So, you know, we have seen the impact through this crisis, even if as a whole society, not everybody could see the impact of inequality in terms of the effects on people's lives. And what we now need to do is look at how we address these challenges. If you take a constituency like mine, and I agree with the point that was being made by Charlotte, that we can sometimes, including in our own party, get into a false dichotomy of South versus North. London being more prosperous, and these generic sort of labels attached to London's wealthy, other parts of the country aren't. Well, you don't have to go very far in London to discover abject poverty in inner city areas like in my constituency. So even though we've seen more investment, including in the last Labour government, we still have stubbornly high rates of child poverty. The highest in the country is in the London borough of Tower Hamlets. And, you know, other boroughs like Newham, neighbouring Newham and other boroughs have faced significant levels of child poverty. And nationally, of course, 30% of children live in poverty, over 4 million children. And this pandemic has made that worse. So where do we go from here if we want to make sure that we link the respective suffering that communities, whether they live in the East End of London, in constituencies like mine, face, and the common cause that they face and common suffering, and those who are living in towns outside of London, across, you know, the so-called red wall seats, where you've seen the failure of economic investment, failure of investment in transport and infrastructure, all those things that revive a town or a city or a region, and the centralization of economic power and wealth being concentrated in only certain parts of the country. So if we are to address those issues, we need to think about inequality in much more granular terms. We need to look at inequality and poverty, pockets of poverty in every part of our country, in every community, whether it's in white disadvantaged communities or BAME communities. We need to look at some of the issues around mental health and the psychological dimension to inequality, and the knock-on effect of mental health issues that can then damage a family's life and then have a knock-on effect on children. And of course, this pandemic has laid bare the mental health challenge even further than it already existed. So if we want to address these issues, we've got to be much more granular in looking at where those pockets of poverty exist, and not think about it in terms of, well, South is rich and North isn't. It's got to be broader than that. It's got to be much more intensive in our understanding and analysis. And that's where, of course, centres like yours are key. The other element of all of this is of course, we need to think about, we cannot disassociate what's happening now and the crisis with what we do in the future. And so if our focus in the last Labour government was about education, education, education. Well, we need an education revolution now, and we need a revolution in terms of investment in children and young people in a way that we've not seen for a very long time. So what does that mean? In my view, that means investing in childcare. The Conservative government has made a lot of promises, tried out different things. Some things have worked, but many of those things haven't worked. And their resources, they've targeted resources actually away from some of the poorest families that need help. They've taken money away from poor families. So we need to reinvest in childcare. We need to reinvest in early years education and redouble investment in those sectors. But we need a much more high-level vocational education system in our country, comparable to Germany. I know lots of people talk about Germany, but also Australia historically has had a very, you know, if you want to look further away, a much better vocational system than many other countries. So we need to look at what works in different parts of the world and adapt and improve to suit our needs. We also need, and when Ed Miliband was leader of the Labour Party, we did a lot of work around developing a pathway for the 50% that don't go to university, so that there's a proper high level, high quality vocational apprenticeship training system all the way to higher apprenticeship, so that it's equivalent to graduate level training and education that's fit for the economy. And as we see the economy changing very dramatically, you know, automation and AI and all of those things are going to transform our economy very quickly. And the kinds of jobs young people do are going to be doing is going to be very different. And all of that is changing dramatically. So we need very dramatic investment, but we also need to think creatively about how education and training happens. The final thing I would say around inequalities and tackling inequalities is we need a radical shift in intergenerational wealth, and that means looking at assets, that means looking at distribution and redistribution of assets, that means looking at how we invest in providing for young people all the way into their mid-20s, in my view, and that means when they leave education, giving them. Right now, the government's introduced the Kickstart program, but actually, I think that doesn't go far enough. It's welcome, but it's only for 6 months. The Future Jobs Fund was a good example of what we did, but we need something even more dramatic. I think we need something that gives people much more longer-term job guarantees with income guarantees who are young, and that because the scarring effect and the long-term life changes of being unemployed if you're young is very damaging for our economy and productivity. So we need a proper job guarantee. And I would say that we should be doing that right the way through, even if we weren't in an economic crisis, because youth unemployment tends to be stubbornly high. And in my constituency, I've seen very high levels of graduate unemployment, particularly among working class graduates of all backgrounds and Black and minority graduates. So you can be you know, you can play by the rules, get a very good degree from a Russell Group university, and still be less likely to be employed than your white counterpart if you're Black or Asian or working class, actually. So these class effects need to be addressed. So as a party, I think the focus that Ed Miliband in the past put on apprenticeships is something we should retain. And the last Labour government in investing in childhood and making sure children and young people have the best possible start in life is going to be good for our economy and our society. And the final thing I would say is about social capital, something I've worked on very, very much throughout my career, which is about looking at how we support the younger generation through their careers, starting from their early years. And that requires very intensive investment in those who are in the world of work through mentoring and support. Because if you come from different working class backgrounds, you don't have access to people who are in the kinds of professions you might be interested in going into. So there are lots of hidden barriers that need to be addressed. And if you live in a region where you've only got a handful of professions or jobs that you can choose from, then you're even more removed. And the technological advances and the acceleration of how we use technology is something we can use to benefit young people in order to do that. So although this is an incredibly difficult, challenging, depressing time, which has laid bare even more the inequalities that exist in our country across different groups, racial as well as social class groups and other groups, regions and so on. What we need to do is instill that sense of ambition that we can create a better society and a more equal society. And I think that this morning's speech and the focus on security and tackling fragility and vulnerability that encompass the things that Kia was talking about in families, in wider society, is a good way to really think about how we rebuild our country coming out of this crisis, but actually how we rebuild it by putting the younger generation, the next generation, at the heart of that recovery, at the heart of that transformation, because that generation is going to be the generation that has to cope with the challenges ahead, not just related to the coronavirus and the economic consequences, but also, of course, climate change and many others. So we need to do much more to refocus our resources as a country to the younger generation, but also level up in terms of assets and redistribution from the older generation to the younger generation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rushanara, for that rallying cry. There's two areas actually that I'd really like us to pick up in the discussion later that you raised. One is this question of jobs and whether, in the face of the scale of unemployment that's expected by the end of this year, sort of we go back to the any job is a good job, or do we still pursue quality jobs? And that's something I'd like to pick up later, as well as the discussion around whether Labour policies always demand investment or whether there are other levers that that we should be looking to. But just last but not least, I would like to pass the microphone before we enter into discussion and welcome questions from the audience on the chat to Richard Partington. Richard, over to you.
Anna, thanks very much for having me. I think the first thing to say first is that I'm not a policy expert. I'm a journalist. I can tell you though about the experience that I've had of covering regional economics and politics and visiting many of the places that levelling up is the subject of. I'm from Warrington in the northwest originally and a supporter of the unfashionable Stoke City Football Club, so I've been going to forgotten towns, left behind towns, whatever you want to call them, for longer than has been fashionable amongst newspaper columnists. So that's certainly something that, you know, is a subject that's close to my heart. But I wanted to begin by talking about, I saw an excellent quote the other day on Twitter, actually, from a former civil servant who was very much focused on the levelling up agenda before it gained that name again. It's a quote from a cabinet minister, and it read, "Urgent action is needed to rebuild and rebalance local economies. The solution needs to be local. By giving up central control, we will put democratic accountability back into the local economy, making it responsive to the needs of local businesses and local people." And that comment wasn't made by Robert Jenrick this year, it was made by Eric Pickles back in 2010. And I think we all know how much local economies and politics has changed since then, very much for the worse. And that idea that handing power back into local communities was so prevalent back in 2010, and then to see the results of that agenda for 10 years really highlights that disparity. Again, it also highlights something that is often, you know, the case when it comes to levelling up or improving regional economies, in that this has been something that's been tried multiple times for several decades. You can go back 40 years or more. You've got Michael Heseltine in Liverpool in the 1980s. The policies to improve underperforming or struggling parts of the country that are feeling left out from economic prosperity has been tried time and time again. However, one area that perhaps hasn't been used as much is devolution. There has been a greater push to encourage spending into regions, but that's never really been put into regional control. So that's one area that I think would be interesting to talk about a little bit more. Over the past 10 years, things that have really gone wrong for local areas, I think one of the cores of this is the funding of local authorities and of councils. Councils have lost about 60 pence in every pound of central government funding since 2010. It's an absolutely phenomenal amount of money that has been removed from the budgets of local councils, making them have to cut back on services since that point. I mean, there has been the move to offer business rates retention, and council taxes have risen, so spending power has been maintained to a degree, but it is still, according to the Institute for Government, about 18% lower than it was in 2010. And all along, pressures are rising on local areas from shifting demographics, changes in society that mean that pressure on local services is increasing throughout all of this time. Now, we talk about devolution there. The only thing, though, is that it seems to be a competition for pots of money that are announced centrally, as I was saying before. You've got the Towns Fund, the Future High Streets Fund, we've got the Beaching Cuts Reversals Fund, all of these pots of cash that just create kind of a competition between local areas that is not particularly helpful for levelling them up and improving life for communities that perhaps haven't made the loudest noise or had the right colour of politician in charge, whether it be blue or red in Westminster. If there's an opposite colour in a local area, maybe they're going to struggle. It's certainly been the story of the past 10 years, but the Labour authorities in the north of England particularly. Another area is local government's local revenue raising and spending capabilities. This is part of the devolution question again. I was writing a little earlier this year on a paper from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. They'd done some analysis of the local revenue raising and spending powers in Britain, and that they say that local revenue and raising capability is much lower in the UK than it is across comparable OECD countries, falling below countries such as Romania and Ukraine. About 2 years ago, I was writing on the same sort of subject, and the IMF, International Monetary Fund, was saying that decentralisation of governance arrangements could be one of the most effective levers for countries to pull in order to increase growth and productivity for the nations as a whole. And this comes back to a challenge again. I talked about there about productivity. The UK, as studies have shown, has got some of the widest regional disparities in productivity in the EU, parts of the UK being the most productive in Europe, in London particularly, and parts of the UK falling behind former Soviet bloc nations. And these imbalances, they tend to show that local areas have got less capability to level themselves up and to be able to be on a par with other parts of the country. In terms of solutions, as I say, I'm not a policy expert. I do write on a lot of policy papers. I'll leave that to the capable hands of the Centre for Progressive Policy to come up with the suggestions, and I'll write about them when I can. But the first thing for me, I would say, is actually not about local policy. I think devolution is a key part, but there is an important national framework that needs to be built to deliver on a levelling up agenda. As we're talking about, central government decisions have led to the 60p in the pound being reduced for local authorities. There are many other things that central government can do to reverse these issues. Number one, for me, would probably be around council tax. It's a hugely regressive tax that was originally in the 1980s introduced in its present form sorry, not 80s, it's 1990s, to take over from the poll tax after the severe unpopularity of Margaret Thatcher's attempt to introduce a poll tax, flat tax. And council tax was seen as a sort of happy way to introduce some progressive way of taxing of wealth instead. But council tax bands have not been reformed since the early 1990s, and as a consequence, you have similar council tax payments on houses in Blackpool as you have in Kensington, and that really just is not, given the large disparities in wealth that we have in the UK, that doesn't appear to be fair or progressive. There are other areas of national policy that would be incredibly helpful to address, reversing benefits cuts of the past 10 years, helping to put more money in the people's pockets in local areas that are particularly struggling for jobs and employment and need that income more. Hiring more public sector workers after, again, large amounts of cuts in the past 10 years. And again, other national policies to drive growth, such as education spending and funding, increasing per pupil funding after real terms cuts for the past decade, increasing spending on infrastructure. We know how much more is spent in London and the southeast on infrastructure than is spent elsewhere. I think also, as I say, devolution is the next leg of this and incredibly important. Building up strong local institutions that are adequately funded and have the powers to spend tax-paid revenue in their local areas is good progress with the mayoral combined authorities, Greater Manchester, Liverpool, the West Midlands, Bristol. We're all seeing progress, but this is just the foothills of really what ought to be a wider move for devolution and local power and accountability and spending capability. One area as we move post-Brexit is the UK's Shared Prosperity Fund, promised several years ago now, consultations of which are still yet to emerge. 2018 was the time when it was first talked of, and whether some of that post-EU funding can be used by local areas instead of by central government would be a really interesting policy suggestion to me. Final point I was asked to speak on was, can Labour win? Speaking to a predominantly Labour audience, I'm intrigued to know what other people think. Clearly, after the 2019 election, Labour did not win and had a pretty disappointing performance on what was essentially in areas a locally fought election. I recall I went to Blythe Valley in the northeast, as it's fashionable for newspaper correspondents to do, to go to red wall seats. And the most effective messaging there was twofold from Ian Levy, the new Conservative MP, the first Tory MP there for 100 years. Get Brexit done and fix our town. And it was the fix our town element that really resonated with people. The 2019 election, I really feel, was one of local politics playing out on a national scale. You had communities that have had Labour councils for decades, Labour MPs for the best part of a century, and they feel as people there felt as though Labour had let them down by being their representatives in that local area, and that their towns had got worse over that time because of a Labour MP was their perspective. Disconnect there between the amount of power that the local authorities and the local Labour MPs had to affect change in those communities, and how much power has been dictated centrally from Westminster. Again, the devolution point that I talked to. So starting from a worrying base that the Conservatives managed to win, given those issues that we see in local towns, but moving on, Labour has some ground to make up and is making some already, as Keir talked about this morning, putting flesh on the bones of what is quite a nebulous statement to level up is an important step from Labour and to do more. So the next stage is to provide credible answers as well as the important moves that are required ahead of the next election.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that. Okay, we've covered already a lot of policy ground, which just speaks to the nature and the complexity of this problem. But I want to hone in on some specific areas of policy. And Rushanara, if I may come to you first, there's been a bit of discussion in this introductory section about devolution, and obviously as a London MP, also under Sadiq Khan, also working with your respective local authorities, what do you feel like is the role for local government or mayors in the levelling up agenda? Is there this balancing act between central government and local government? Where do you see that lying? Could we unmute Rushanara, please?
Hi there. I think we're having to wait a bit before you guys unmute us. So, so on devolution, I think that Richard's obviously already touched on this. Just picking up on the broader point, over the last decade, what we've seen is the language of devolution under the coalition government and the Conservative government, but that doesn't go with resources. In fact, quite the opposite. So the politics of that is obviously serving the Conservatives very well, because they can blame Labour-controlled councils and Labour MPs while they dictate the resources. And we're seeing that happening in a very cynical way. For instance, during this crisis, in the way that mayors are often finding they're not involved in decisions that are being made by national government, very life-changing decisions, life-threatening issues are being dealt with in relation to the pandemic without a proper partnership across local and regional government and national government. Now, some people would say, oh, that's because there's a crisis, so, you know, these things happen. But actually, there's this government and its predecessor governments have formed. So, and we've seen that in London, the way that the Mayor of London has had to sign up to a set of conditions. And shockingly, those include taking resources away from young people, for instance, you know, the free travel passes and things like that. A whole load of conditions that would be, that are politically very cynical, which is about damaging the London Labour London mayor. So I think the principle of trying to devolve power and control is an absolutely correct one, and our party tried to devolve power, but I would argue we didn't go far enough. I'm not a believer in devolving everything. I grew up in a context of extreme decentralization in a borough, in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, where decentralization under a Liberal controlled council led to a very divisive, racialized, conflictual environment, and competition between 7 different town halls, in effect, and it was very wasteful and dangerous. So some things are better served through, you know, that are not overly decentralized, that can turn communities against each other, and we have to be careful about that. But there are many things where devolving power from the national government into local and regional government is better, because it generates more innovation and creativity. Regional government is much closer to the communities they serve, local government much closer, and have a great deal of experience and wisdom in delivery. I've been completely heartened by the way that my local authority with other partners and other local agencies have worked during this crisis. And I know that their partnership working, being close to the communities they serve, has saved lives. And so dismantling that, you know, the shift away from that and centralizing power, which is what this government has been doing through this crisis as well, is really dangerous, whether it's primary care and health or it's local government. So I think we need to really have a very different settlement. Labour needs to create a much more innovative settlement around devolution, which is which goes with resources, which is about power and resources, but it's also about accountability, of course, and common standards. So I'm not a believer in returning to the bad old days of local authorities having control over services if they can't deliver. I think it's really important to have local council, local government accountability and local public accountability and elected accountability, but we need to be really imaginative in making sure the outcomes serve people, which speaks to Richard's point, which is that if you are too ideological about how you deliver services, then you fail people. And again, I revert to my own experience of growing up in the East End of London, where schools were failing. You know, by 1997, you know, under you know, different local governments, different parties, Liberal Democrats predominantly during the 80s and 90s, the education system was failing my authority. Kids coming out of school, my contemporaries came out with nothing to show for themselves. The local education authority was in charge. But equally, the investment in local government and funding then meant we were one of the best education authorities in the country. So you can see both kinds of outcomes through local devolution, and we can't afford to fail generations by being ideological about who is in control of what services. But the fundamental line that has to cut across is about public accountability and elected representatives and civil service, so the civil service as well, being accountable to the people.
Yeah, absolutely. And Charlotte, perhaps I could come in here, you know, going down the kind of devolution path of the policy mix that you were speaking about in your introduction. Where do you think they best lie in terms of, you know, the emerging mayoral combined authorities at local authority level? Where do you think levelling up is best delivered in terms of your policy mix?
I think, and this speaks to Rushanara's point about balance, that whilst the subsidiarity principle should hold, i.e. where you can take decision making at the lowest level, you should do, I think there is something powerful in the strategic economic footprint of the mayoral combined authority model. And London has its own kind of solution to that with the way that the boroughs and the GLA work together. But I think outside of London, I think the way in which mayoral combined authorities and that either exist or are sort of in the making are starting to come together across a footprint that makes sense for their kind of economic geography. And I think, you know, I recognise Rushanara's point on having a more innovative settlement, but I think going with the grain of where we've got to, rather than trying to rewrite the map and the boundaries as they currently exist, I don't think that would be a good use of time or energy. And I think where we can see where some of them are already working. So it's how you expand on that principle and then look to translate education and training budgets, particularly for kind of post-16, post-19, you know, ways of delivering future jobs fund equivalent at that level. I think that's going to be key.
Well, thank you, because education, in fact, was something that's been picked up over the last few days in conference, and making sure that that accountability between schools that are either in the academy system or free schools come within a kind of tighter local control more than they have so at the moment. And obviously we saw this morning that Keir brought education front and centre of the levelling up agenda. Rushanara, if I may come back to you on the education point, I mean, you know, looking at the statistics of London versus the rest of the country, London and the southeast, it's still doing better than the rest of the country on attainment and proportion of schools that are good or outstanding. Do you see that as something that could, you know, still be the legitimate focus of Labour's levelling up policy, even if London so far is still ahead?
Look, I think to address this question, we need to look at what's happened. Labour in government invested billions into education. It basically took over a decade to try and improve attainment in cities like London. But if you go to look at the 80s and even into the 90s, as I say, by the time Labour, Tony Blair became Prime Minister, my borough had 7% of kids coming out of school with 5 or more GCSEs to show for themselves. That's not because we didn't have talent, it's because the previous Conservative government just completely neglected these areas. So what you see is then transformation in education, and a fairly kind of hard-nosed response, setting up Ofsted to look at measurements. And yes, there was resistance, but the measurements were really important. And looking at how we can get improvements between different groups. The things like the pupil level annual census data was really powerful in understanding what was happening to children's attainment. Black education underachievement, education maintenance support, grants to young people who are from poorer backgrounds, the work around EMAG grants to help with areas with which became something else under the Lib Dems when they were in coalition. But the point is that you need to invest in order to transform education. That's what happened during the Labour government. In other regions, I mean, in London, I think things like, in my borough, it was pre-London, I think it was called, I forget what it was called. There was a programme which was worked very effectively across London to raise attainment.
London Challenge.
London Challenge. And Hackney and Tower Hamlets had done a lot of work through collaborative working with schools to improve attainment. But there was room for innovation, which helped lift standards. What then happened is when the Conservatives came in, you know, I find it rather rich, this government going on about levelling up, because they've done nothing but level down by taking money away from London schools, even though we've got the highest child poverty rate in the country, twice as much. And in boroughs like mine, an eighth of funding, and then it continued to further erode, funding was taken away from school children. And kids go hungry in constituencies like mine. So you know, how are we going to retain their attainment levels if they're going hungry? So my local authority spends £700,000 every summer on a hunger program. Now they're not going to be able to afford to do that now in the future, because the government's not going to pay for the COVID costs, which is about 30 million. There's a deficit of about 30 million that's not being met. That's the case up and down the country. So the government speaks about levelling up, but they have shown that they are quite happy to level down and actually damage the attainment that has been achieved over a decade of investment. And then and what we're going to see now is the government doing down and dumbing down, actually, rather than levelling up. So we've been calling for the last few years. We've begged and pleaded the government not to take £3 billion out of the education system, which they did. Then they had to reverse some of that, but not all of it. And so if they were serious about levelling up, and that's something we need to look carefully at ourselves, then they would actually look at the successes in cities like London in dealing with the attainment gap and improving schools. You know, we had some very difficult issues with schools in Tower Hamlets and Hackney and elsewhere in the 90s. Those schools are among the best in the country now, and it didn't happen by accident. If they were serious, they would look at the things that worked in London, look at what works and what could be adapted for the other cities. We should have London Challenge equivalents up and down the country. Of course, you can't replicate the same things, but we need to understand what the needs are in those places and make sure there's another issue about teaching, paying people better in different regions. When I was Shadow Education Minister, what was clear was that many towns and cities struggled to recruit teachers. There were issues around transport, issues around further education we haven't talked about. Further education. You've got millions of young people and young adults going into further education, and the funding has receded over many decades in those places. Many of them have had to merge to survive. And if you're interested as a party, we need to invest in FE, because the high concentration of working class kids and young adults in further education would help us really target our investment in improving the lot of working class and BAME communities.
Yeah, I really think bringing in the class dimension there is so important, because it's absolutely right, and that link between FE and the class of children that end up there, and yet the lack of investment, and that is an ongoing knot and infuriation for those of us who care about vocational skills policy. I also really like how you're talking about the supporting infrastructure to those in education, that you can look at the attainment and the percentage of good schools, but if you've got hungry kids, then how do you expect them to maintain and sustain that? Related, Charlotte, I was thinking of childcare. Rushanara picked up on it, and as did you in your remarks. What are Labour doing on childcare to help support the levelling up agenda?
Well, I've written previously about the fact that women not just face discrimination in the workplace, but they face what I call a crash ceiling. And we've seen that mothers are, 1.5 times more likely to have lost their job or to be put on furlough under lockdown. Primarily that's because they're taking on the bulk of childcare, not during this period, but in general. So we need to make more affordable, high quality childcare available to women, particularly those who cannot access good quality jobs otherwise. And we know that, for example, women are more likely to be on 0-hour contracts. So if the emphasis is on security, there's much more to be done to support women in the labour market, particularly when we know that most households rely on dual incomes in order just to get by. So there's three things which I'll rattle through very quickly, which I think Labour could do, and soon. So first of all, it can increase access to subsidised childcare for the poorest families, so that it starts as soon as a mother finishes her maternity leave. At the moment, she has to wait until the child is 2 to be eligible. So if she takes, say, 1 year max maternity, she's got a whole year to wait before she can get access to subsidised childcare. The second is that we've got to increase the funding available for the 30 hours of funding that the government does support currently a week, because we are seeing the viability of the sector really threatened during the COVID crisis. And finally, I think we need to extend subsidised childcare availability for parents who are trying to train. Let's not penalise those people who are trying to, get on and up, to reskill if they're likely to lose their job or have lost their job during this crisis. We need to support parents to be learning and to get back into the workforce. And so we've got to be supporting them on childcare.
Well, and there's a lot of support in the chat for investment in education and in FE in particular. Thank you to Amanda Phoenix. If I'm now linking over to Richard, I'm picking up what I flagged earlier around in the face of the biggest rise in unemployment we've seen in recent history, what should we be focused on? Is it getting people into any job, or should Labour still be focusing on the good jobs agenda?
So it's a really difficult one. I mean, we're facing at the moment unemployment perhaps doubling in the UK as a consequence of the coronavirus pandemic, and it really cuts to the heart of the levelling up agenda. To bring it back to that point, in the places, there has been analysis that the places that had the weakest labour markets prior to the pandemic hitting are those that have seen the fastest increases of unemployment so far. The data is still very early days, but Blackpool, Hull, Birmingham, cities and towns that had higher rates of unemployment related benefit claimants than elsewhere have seen the biggest increases during the crisis. And yeah, in terms of policy responses and encouraging job creation, the Kickstart scheme, as Rushanara talked about before, is a good start. It perhaps doesn't go far enough in terms of the amount of funding and for the number of places. There's been a sharpest increase in job losses and furloughing at the younger end of the jobs market. The 25s in particular, seen a dramatic increase in numbers claiming universal credit. So the scale and the ambition of that job support scheme could be expanded. Whether it's going to deliver high quality jobs of the future is a question mark. Yeah. There could be greater conditions placed on the government for employers to take on those people, but then I guess their comeback would be, does that risk a loss of jobs being created? Well,
thank you.
Sorry, can I just come back on that point?
Yes.
If you look at it, just a kind of point about money and how the government's spending money in this crisis. If you look at what they've done, they've decided to spend £9 billion on the job retention bonus scheme. They are requiring, on the Kickstart, they are expecting companies to recruit 30 young people in one go or form a consortium. It would be a whole lot easier if they could make that number smaller. Of course, there needs to be accountability to avoid employers exploiting young people. But there are ways of doing that so that small and medium-sized businesses, charities and others could take young people on, as Kickstarters. The other thing is you have to be on universal credit for 6 months before you get on. And also, it's not really particularly going to be suitable for people who've just come out of university because many of the opportunities that might be, it links to the point about types of jobs, many of the opportunities that might be available won't be ones that necessarily are ones that would be what they were hoping to get. So you will get underemployment and people doing jobs that they're not necessarily, they have, they could do other jobs. So that program is going to need a radical overhaul to make it effective, or we're not going to see hundreds of thousands of people, young people, being able to get on the job ladder through it. In fact, it's going to be potentially one more thing the government announces sounds good, and there's a promise of a big price ticket to go with it, but actually it doesn't help young people. The job retention bonus money could be used to provide a targeted furloughing scheme for those who are particularly hit hard. And we're seeing today's announcement means that those who are in the hospitality sector, yet again, are going to suffer. And there are many other sectors like that. So the money is not being targeted properly to those who need it. And the final thing I'd just flag up is that the government's wasted £3.5 billion, which has been given to people in error and fraudulent activity. Not all of it is fraudulent, but they need to recover it because only a few hundred million has been recovered. Now, the question is, this is public money, and this is money that could be saved to put in education, to put in children that are going hungry in constituencies like mine or in those red wall seats. And the government's just on this free-for-all and wasting money, and they need to stop doing that and giving it to people who desperately need it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rushanara. And on that rallying note, I think we can all agree that's been an excellent and wide-ranging discussion, showing us levelling up is so much more than just a narrow set of economic indicators of success, but needs to bring in all those critical elements of public policy, childcare, local power, FE system and skills, jobs, but whilst also targeting money well. So thank you very much to all of our speakers today. It's been fantastic to have you here. And now I'm going to pass over to Charlotte, who's going to host our follow-up session on policy delivery. Many thanks.
So just an invitation for those of you who would like to stay to join this hour, what we're billing a policy clinic. We're going to be drilling down on some of the themes that were picked up in the previous session, health inequalities, skills, devolution in particular. And I've got my super duper CPP team and our lead analysts for each of those areas coming online now to talk to you about each of those themes. So I can see Ben Franklin, our head of research. Ben also leads our work on health, and I can see Andy Norman, who's just joining, who leads our work on skills, and Dan Gardner, who is Senior Network Lead for our new Inclusive Growth Network, a network of 12 places that we're working with, funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and in partnership with others to really help them to implement on the ground effective inclusive growth strategies. So the format for this hour is that we're going to dedicate 15 minutes of discussion to each of the themes in health inequalities, skills and devolution in that order. You're going to hear 5 minutes from the CPP lead analyst, and then we'll go into discussion either on the chat. If you want to raise questions, do let us know. Otherwise, we can also be kind of teasing out some of those questions amongst ourselves, but really encouraging you to be as engaged and active as possible. But I shall hand over to Ben first.
Thanks very much, Charlotte, and hello everyone who's joined us and is staying with us from the previous session. That's brilliant. So I'm going to talk about health and some of the CPP's work around health over the last 12 to 18 months or so. And obviously health is a really prominent issue right now because of COVID and how COVID has really reinforced the issue of health inequalities in the UK, which we already knew of beforehand, but has really illuminated some of these challenges even more so since. I think the first point I'd like to make is around the importance of the NHS in determining health. So obviously a lot of focus within this crisis has all been about putting more capacity into the NHS to deal with COVID and firefighting this issue, and that's fine. But over the longer term, it is only a small proportion of health within places that is determined by the NHS. Important though the NHS is. It's things like employment, good jobs, skills, housing, affordable housing, but also good quality housing, which is so important. So from the CPP's point of view, we talk about population health more than we talk about health in the narrow sense of curing disease within the NHS. And that's really important. You know, there's a 19-year healthy life expectancy gap between the most affluent and the poorest places in the UK, which is an absolute tragedy and has obviously been revealed even more so during this COVID crisis. Obesity is a really good example of all this. Obesity has come onto the forefront recently as a result of COVID and because of higher mortality rates for people who are overweight. And I wonder, Zara, if we could have the table that we published recently in a short report on obesity and what we can do about it. But what you'll see is that, in particular, areas that have higher levels of deprivation are particularly vulnerable. So if you look at the table, you can see the mortality rates from COVID, but also all causes of mortality. And this is during the peak of the wave. We've also got health behaviours. So this is the proportion that are overweight and the proportion that are able to have engage in physical activity regularly. And then access to healthy and unhealthy food. And you can basically see that at each stage of this journey, more deprived deciles fare worst. And that's considerably worse in many cases. And actually, one of the most startling statistics in all of this table is around the cost of living, of eating healthily. And this is based on the NHS Eat Well guide from work that the Food Foundation did a year or so ago. For people in the most deprived decile, it would cost around 74% of household disposable income. So people just can't afford to eat healthily. So what can we do about all of this? I realise I've only got 5 minutes. So how do you solve a problem like obesity is quite a big issue, obviously. But clearly just narrow solutions are not the answer in this sense. It has to be a whole of government approach, both at national level in terms of doing things like having a health inequality strategy is something we've argued for, but also what government are doing, which is good, is around thinking about food advertising. But what can we do in terms of food security itself? And it's great that Marcus Rashford and others have got behind, and other supermarkets as well, have got behind his agenda on food security, but linking that much more clearly to obesity and child health is a crucial next step. And when thinking about child health in the round more broadly as well, I think it's time that we started thinking more carefully about getting Sure Start back from where we were previously, where an IFS research has shown that it's clearly beneficial to children in deprived communities in particular. And so it's quite a highly efficient way of supporting child health in the long run, and part of a kind of a more broader preventative agenda, which is place-based as well. And then finally, I'd like to talk about properly funding local public health systems as well. So we've seen continuous cuts to the local authority, the public grant for public health, but recent research from University of York showed that the return on investment for the local authority public health grant was 3.5 times more productive than healthcare. And I think that's a really important takeaway from all of this. Throwing more money at the NHS and the health service is not going to be the answer to supporting longer term sustainability, both of the health service, but of population health more broadly. And thereby that can act as a supportive platform for inclusive growth over the longer term.
Fantastic, thanks Ben. And a follow-up question from me, which is how do you think we wean ourselves off NHS acute care being seen as the solution to how we create healthy communities, particularly in light of COVID? But the issue goes further back, because when the PM was talking about levelling up even prior to the health emergency, he was talking about investing in hospitals as a way to tackle health inequalities, which our evidence and others would suggest isn't the way to go. So how do we wean ourselves off that?
Well, I think we have to be more honest generally about the efficiency of continuing to invest money in the health service. I mean, the Office for Budget Responsibility is quite stark on this point. So if you look at their long run fiscal forecasts, it shows that basically because of continued investment in the health service, our debt to GDP is going to exceed 200% by 2050. And that's just not a sustainable state of affairs. So I think it starts from that realization, as much as it is obviously a big moral question, as well as how you improve the health of the nation. And clearly population health is key to that. But if you're trying to make an efficiency argument as well, then the fact is that we cannot afford it as a country if we continue to pump money into the NHS at any cost. And it's also going to take resources away from other much needed sectors, including education, which in itself helps to determine health probably as much as the health service itself. So I think we need to find a better way of configuring the way we do public spending to support preventative measures rather than just curing.
So we're here at Labour Conference, and I think Labour still outperforms the Conservative Party on public confidence with regards to the NHS, and has long done so. So do you think it's easier for the Labour Party to try and sort of bring about that shift in its public messaging as we come out of COVID, potentially, you know, another 6 months down the line? But the long game has got to be for, you know, Keir Starmer to be standing on a platform and saying we need a whole different approach. What would you be advising him and Claire Ainsley and others?
So I think given that Labour are trusted on the NHS, Labour needs to be trusted on health more broadly. And I think that's the crucial part of this. As a Secretary of State, it's not just about the NHS waiting lists, etc. It's about being accountable for reducing health inequalities. And ultimately, that has to be a core driving narrative behind Labour in terms of a social justice angle. And I know it's something that the Shadow Health Secretary has spoken quite passionately about in the past. So I'm very optimistic about that. But it's about thinking about health and being trusted on health rather than just the NHS, I think.
Great. Well, I think unless there are any questions from our audience members who managed to dial back in, and apologies for that little technical hitch, we're talking to the team now. I will turn to Andy Norman, who leads on our skills agenda. So over to you, Andy.
Yeah, thanks very much, Charlotte. I want to start by going back to pre-COVID and just reminding ourselves of what kind of state our skills system was in back then. And I think we can sum it up as having three particular challenges that it was facing. The first was a pretty serious fall in participation and investment over the last 10, 15 years. And in terms of participation, that's down 37%. And actually total spending on adult education and skills is down 39% in real terms since 2002. So that's a really big problem. We've got fewer people and less money being spent on the system. The second key challenge is we're seeing pretty shocking levels of inequality in participation. And a really powerful statistic on this is that those people who have a master's degree are 3 times more likely to receive further work-related training than those without GCSEs. So this is how you get this sort of vicious cycle of learning where those people with higher skills are learning more and the inequality is growing. So that's the first 2 key challenges. The third key challenge, I would say, is a place-based inequality in skills. And here at the CPP, we've done some number crunching on this and looking at people in the former Red Wall. Compared to the rest of England, they're much less likely to be qualified to level 4 and above, and much more likely not to have any formal qualifications at all. And on top of that, they're also less likely to receive training from their employer. So that's where we stood in February this year. And it won't be a huge surprise to any of you when I say that COVID-19 has made things worse. We'll all be familiar with the big projected increases in unemployment that we think are going to be coming our way, particularly after the furlough scheme ends. So that means that skills and training is more important than ever, but that's coming at a time of unprecedented strain on businesses financially. So we're likely to see private investment in training across the country really suffer. And as other studies have shown, this is likely to hit young people the hardest. It's likely to hit people in low wage jobs hard as well. So what's the data telling us on this? First of all, there's been some fairly good apprenticeships data that's been released since the outbreak of COVID-19, and it's really quite alarming. Apprenticeship starts for people under the age of 19 has fallen by 68% since the outbreak of the coronavirus, which is completely shocking. And if you compare that to, you know, imagine if we had a 68% fall in university places for young people, the absolute outcry that you'd have in the whole country. Similarly worrying, we've had a 63% fall in apprenticeship starts at level 2. So what we're seeing is this sort of bottom rung of the skills ladder being taken away. 2/3 of opportunities for young people to enter training that will eventually lead them to a good job has just been removed by COVID, from a situation that wasn't very good to start with. So what does that all mean? It means that an inclusive recovery is in jeopardy, and that the trends of COVID-19 are exacerbating existing inequalities. So what do we need? CPP has called for a turbocharged right to retrain to help people who are in danger of losing their jobs as a result of COVID-19. There's people in these much talked about zombie jobs. We have a choice for them. Either they can move into long-term unemployment, or we can properly invest in retraining them into the good jobs of the future. So as I say, we've called for a turbocharged right to retrain. What does this mean in practice? Well, first and foremost, I think it means building on this momentum for high quality online learning. Lots of us have become more familiar with leading our lives online, and I think that opens an opportunity to get more learning online. Some progress has been made on this, but not enough. The government can go far further. The government also should be having greater public subsidies for existing training, particularly apprenticeships. The government announced recently that they are going to pay employers a bonus of £2,000 per young apprentice that they take on. That equates to a subsidy of just 13% of a young apprentice's wages for a year. That's not enough to shift decision making from employers. We think the wage subsidy should be at least 50%. We also call for a learner's living allowance so that people who need to undertake training are supported by the state to do so. And we also think that ramping up local strategic input into skills decisions led by combined authorities is the right way to go. There is some hope. There are examples of around the world of sector-based training programs working really well. There's a couple in the US that show that participants can earn upwards of $300 more a month than for control groups, and that they can move into actually pretty good, decent jobs with benefits. So bit of a bleak picture, but there is hope if we act as we think we should. Thanks very much.
Fantastic, thanks Andy. So a couple of questions to follow up on. So you mentioned there about the role that sectors can play in boosting skills that pertain to them and their supply chains. What would you say to the current government who would say, well, you know, each sector is experiencing a very different approach, a different impact, sorry, of COVID-19, and you know, it's fair, therefore, that we should think about a sector response to aviation, hospitality, or whatever in terms of skills. Similarly, you know, you could argue it from, well, we need to create a green economy, green manufacturing. We can approach that in a sector-based way rather than a place-based approach. What would you say to that?
Well, we can see a clear place-based inequality in terms of training across the UK. As I mentioned before, if you're in the Red Wall or a former Red Wall, or basically just outside of the southeastern London, your level of qualification is likely to be much lower, and correspondingly there are far fewer well-paid jobs in those areas as well. So I think it's about both taking a place-based and a sectoral view. Yes, sector is important. You can see that in the apprenticeship data. We've got an almost 100% fall in opportunities for apprentices in the travel and tourism sector. So I think it's both. I think absolutely we need a place-based approach, but we also need to be aware that different sectors are being hit differently by COVID.
And then we've got a question from Richard Annandale. Thank you, Richard. He says, other European countries are light years ahead of us on apprenticeships. Are there some positive actions we can bring in from other countries? And to that, I wondered whether you think that, although this is a UK or English initiative around T-levels, whether they'll give a sufficient pathway for the 50% that don't go to university that Rushanara was talking about in the previous session. Is that going to be enough to make sure that apprenticeships can really get off the ground? Because so many different leaders on both sides of the political spectrum have kind of held them up as the new big idea.
I support the principle of T-levels. The reason why they're being brought in as the key level 3 technical qualification is for years we've had thousands of level 3 technical qualifications that employers find very difficult to understand the value of. Whereas you contrast that to A-levels, and every employer in the country knows the value of an A-level. So they're trying to replicate that as a sort of signal of level 3 technical skills for employers. So I guess its success will depend on whether it is able to deliver those key skills that employers want at level 3. There have been questions about where is it going to lead if I do a level 3 T-level. Some of the big academic universities have suggested that they may not accept T-levels as entry to university, but that doesn't concern me too much because, you know, if you want to go to university and do an academic qualification, we already have a route for that. We have A-levels. Whereas T-levels, the big question is, can the government come up with level 4 and level 5 higher technical qualifications that can be done after a level 3 T-level? So we want this pipeline of high quality technical skills that doesn't just stop at T-levels, that goes on to higher technical qualifications as well, which is an area that we really do fall behind our European counterparts. You know, you look at the percentage of people who are doing a level 4 or a 5 qualification in this country, and it's tiny. We for too long have just assumed you go from level 4 straight to university, and that's really the only route. We need far more people to take up T-levels, and then after that have an offer of a high quality level 4 or 5 if they need it.
And Rushanara mentioned Germany and she mentioned Australia. Would you add any other countries onto the list where we should be looking?
Yeah, Sweden does a good job. Switzerland is a good example of devolved skills systems. Singapore is another example of individualized learner accounts. They have this skills credit system that seems to work quite well. There is a note of caution when you're looking at international comparisons, because you know, the UK is a very different place to Singapore. It doesn't necessarily mean what works in Singapore works here, but it's important to look at what kind of lessons can we learn from these international examples, and what would be applicable in our own unique context.
And okay, one more question from me, if I may. So we've talked in our work about having a right to retrain. We've also seen government kind of ignore all the signs that say we're going to need to put a massive level of attention on retraining and upskilling and all the kind of employment support and access to learning opportunities come the end of the furlough scheme. Do you think this moment presents an opportunity for us to really get employer engagement on the development of skills at a place level right? You know, when businesses are really sort of questioning how and where and when and they survive.
Yeah.
Do you think that's the time where they can have that kind of conversation with government and really shift things up?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's the time when it's opportune to be having these conversations. But as I mentioned before, lots of businesses are going to be over the next 6 months focused on one thing alone, and that's survival. So the government needs to stand ready to support businesses to be able to have these kinds of conversations on skills, and to bring them into the picture on the apprenticeship levy, also on T-levels as well. We're hoping, the government is hoping that employers will be able to take on T-level students as placements. So it's about supporting employers to be able to engage in the system at the moment. I think these are extraordinary times in terms to be a business. And it would be understandable if investment in private skills training goes down, but that's exactly why the government needs to be ready to step in on these.
Fantastic, thanks so much. Well, at this stage, I'm actually going to turn to Dan. He can provide, I think, a neat bridge between policy and initiatives that are being designed at a local level, just as we see in some places on skills, although to a limited degree, primarily because of central government constraints, I should add to that. And then I'll do a kind of quick addition to some of the remarks I made in the previous session on what I think devolution should look like and what we expect from the devolution white paper. But I'll hand over to Dan first.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte, and thanks everyone for sticking around for this discussion. So I am the Senior Network Lead at CPP. The network in my title refers to the Inclusive Growth Network, which I'm really happy to say we launched last week. And we at CPP are the hosts of the network, and it's fully funded by the JRF. As Charlotte's touched on already, the network brings together 12 councils and combined authorities from across the UK who are leading the drive for more inclusive economies. And as the network, we provide our members with a package of support which will be structured around priorities which they have identified. And what I wanted to use this slot to do is to touch briefly on a couple of these priorities which our members have identified, which I think showcase the level of ambition and innovation at a local level, but also the potential and necessity of further devolution in the context of an inclusive recovery. So really interested to hear of any further examples from other areas and how devolution might help advance your local ambitions. So a real key priority for the network this year will unsurprisingly be planning for recovery and the local implementation of these plans. And I think there are solid local foundations to deliver on this, such as the importance of collaboration between anchor institutions, which we see in places like Bristol, which underpin Bristol's one city approach. Also the need to align economic and social policy ambitions, which is something we've seen reflected in the Leeds Inclusive Growth Strategy, and also by research published by the Health Foundation this week that highlights the work in Leeds as well. And emerging local recovery plans are seeking to build on these foundations with an emphasis placed by many areas on the need to build back better from this crisis. And I think the recovery plan published by Liverpool City Region is particularly relevant to this discussion because it reflects on the need for delivery at different spatial levels, which I think is really critical to the devolution debate. So, for example, on support for businesses, it recognises that on issues such as taxation to support business through this difficult period, national government is best placed to lead on this. But if you look at something like business support services, that's something that they would argue is better devolved and delivered locally, where it can be tailored to the needs of the local business base. And so while there's a spectrum of views on what a model of recovery should look like, I think one area where there's really widespread support is for this concept of a green recovery, which will be another key priority for the network and its members. And again, I think it's safe to say there's solid foundations to be built upon here. So local governments demonstrated real leadership on decarbonisation, and that's certainly true of our network members, all of whom have declared a climate emergency, which they've acted upon. And examples of this action include a clean air zone due to come into place in Greater Manchester in 2022, major energy efficiency programs like Barking and Dagenham's brilliantly named Cozy Home scheme, and significant advances we've seen in recent months in terms of the kind of initial response to the pandemic on things like pop-up cycling and walking routes across the country. And despite this local action, many local leaders, recently including the Mayor of Sheffield City region, have argued that securing a sort of a green and inclusive model of recovery will be contingent on further national investment and devolution. And a common theme across these recovery plans are sort of investment asks of government to enable places to deliver the physical and social infrastructure needed to support their places on this journey to an inclusive recovery. So that's a snapshot of a couple of the priorities in the kind of recovery space. Beyond that, certainly key priorities for the network include tackling health inequalities, which Ben has already touched on, and also pursuing the good work agenda. And I think that, again, that's particularly relevant to the kind of broader debate going on around the policy response to COVID-19, which some may present as a trade-off between good work and any work. And what we see in a lot of local areas and within the Inclusive Growth Network's membership is a real emphasis placed on continuing to pursue the good work agenda through things like the Good Work Pledge in the north of Tyne, or fair employment charters, which have been established in Greater Manchester and being developed elsewhere in places like the Liverpool City region. I think that across these priorities and the related local examples that I've touched upon, but are by no means exhaustive, these show the real value and importance of local leadership and innovation to driving a recovery, but also the potential of devolution in a model of national recovery that can be delivered through local action and leadership. So we'll be supporting members of the Inclusive Growth Network to accelerate their ambitions for recovery. And we'll also be sharing our learning to ensure that other places, policymakers can benefit from this as well. So if you want to find out more and keep up to date with the latest developments, then I'll post the link to our Twitter, but also our website, where we'll be sharing emerging evidence and lessons learned from the network's work.
Thanks, Dan, that's great. And Amanda has just posted about this chiming with the Mayor of Jamie Driscoll, who I think was at our launch event last week, wasn't he? Yeah, so that's great. I think that's an important point for me, just to add a few other kind of observations, really. So the Devolution and Local Recovery White Paper was promised in September, and then it was looking like it was going to be pushed back into the autumn to align with the CSR, and now it's likely to be published at some point in the new year. And I think the fact that it keeps getting pushed back is an indication that the current government hasn't decided yet the extent to which it will emphasise the role of local government and local leadership in shaping and delivering policies for recovery, and thinking about their role more broadly in creating a sustainable platform for clean, inclusive growth. And it's worth mentioning that this white paper has its origins in what was promised in a 2017 manifesto commitment back when Theresa May was Tory party leader. And she was promising that they would establish a devolution framework that would start to try and give some clarity and consistency between the devolved powers that places were getting, whether they were city regions and or more rural kind of counties. And that was in 2017, and we're now in 2020, where this kind of augmented version of that, with the emphasis on local recovery, isn't expected into 2021. So I think there's a real political tension, and that's not just about kind of compulsory unitarisation for the local government geeks out there. This is actually a more fundamental ideological question about where the Conservative Party thinks that where the driving impetus is for local recovery and inclusive growth more broadly. So I think Labour has a real policy question to ask about the extent to which, we heard from Rushanara, it really builds on and improves upon the degree of devolution we've seen to mayoral combined authorities, particularly sort of since the 2014-2015 era, and or whether it wants to push on a kind of more wider regional dimension. So the Northern Powerhouse, the Midlands Engine, you know, what role and purpose might they play? And we at CPP believe that they should play a non-statutory role so that they can be real kind of coordinating collaborative bodies rather than another tier of government. But there are, you know, various views within that. But the other thing we don't want to lose either is the level of local government responsibility. And I think there's this balancing act to get between subsidiarity, where local decision making is taken as local as possible, and then also strategic economic and social policy and investment decision making, which we would argue needs to happen at a wider economic footprint, because the way we live our lives aren't usually defined by sort of administrative council boundaries. So we need some flex. We need to be able to have public services and economic institutions that respond to how we live and work, and that is the beauty of devolution. So we've got to think about the geography. We've got to get that right. We've got to bolster the powers that are given to mayors, such as Jamie Driscoll, Andy Burnham, and others, and to really dig deep and make this work, because I think it would address some fundamental faults in our constitutional settlement that COVID has exposed. And I think we're seeing that both between UK and Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, big capital D devolution, and also in terms of powers and, you know, even access given to local authorities in terms of data on COVID. Something that seems pretty sort of back end, functional, surely that can just happen. How on earth is it possible that they still don't have access weeks and weeks and weeks? And, you know, Ben and I would be discussing, you know, if central government is looking to play a part in responding to the health emergency side, where there is allegedly capacity to do so in terms of local public health directors, central government has got to give them the tools in order to respond and to exercise their duty to their local people and communities. So some real inconsistencies at the moment. We've got to address those. And I think, well, I just look forward to having more conversations this week about how Labour is going to develop its own agenda on that particular point. So I'm just looking, and I think, Amanda, you might be our sole survivor now from the technical hitch, and I'm sure people are doing other things. So are there any other aspects that you wanted to quiz us on? If so, feel free to unmute yourself.
No, thank you. You've talked about national, you've talked about local, you've remembered everyone. It's lovely to hear, so thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for joining us. And we hope that you'll follow our work. And I think I detected a bit of a northeast twang there. So hopefully our work with North of Tyne and some of the other leaders and councils in the northeast means that we cross paths again.